I'm having technical issues. Like, my microphone doesn't want to switch on, and my headset didn't want to switch over to my headset. But yeah, I'm here. Running late, but I again was having technical issues. Still don't think I have everything set yet. Let's see. Just like I couldn't get my model changes to work for some reason, so I don't get to do the chibi ties anymore, or couldn't even get the head pads working. My music is loud. Okay, well, maybe that'll work now. I don't know, can you hear me? The microphone says it's picking me up. Okay, I can hear myself, so I guess that's good. Hey, Oni. I'm still coughing, so I apologize for that. I think I had to edit down my video last night just to cut out all the coughing that I was doing. I do have hot tea and I have cold water and other miscellaneous things. So hopefully it won't be too bad tonight. Can't open my cough medicine. I guess everyone's in ad breaks again. Again, I do apologize for stream restarting. And I will try to mute in case of me needing to cough or blow my nose, because, you know, I'm still not over what I had last week yet. Can I turn my music all the way down? Okay. So, well, I'll wait till the ads are over, I guess. I don't want ads. I don't know. Didn't say it did. Oh, okay. Ad should be over. Yep, there it is. So, in case anyone didn't see me talking about it on Twitter, Book 2, at least the hardback version of it so far, has been slated for release. And I've already got one somewhat critical review because I let someone read my author proof. And they said, these stories are a lot darker. I'm not sure if I would read these to kids. I said, well, they are fairy tales. As they were. So, second book's a little darker, apparently. But, I mean, it does have a Bluebeard and a few other ones in it, so it's not quite as nice of fairy tales. And, you know, I did describe some things in my translations that probably aren't nearly as kid-friendly. But if you want kid-friendly, that's what my book house is for. Because those were actually written by a mother who wanted to have kid-friendly fairy tales. I may eventually get to reading those on the stream too. I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet. But I hope everyone's had a good week. Don't hear my library sounds.
Criminal, yes. Just comply.
Oh, it's an ad. Oops. Seem to fix that. Okay, now it's into the regular audio. But again, I hope everyone had a great week. Hope you will enjoy a nice weekend. But we are here for fairy tales because it is Friday night, and that's what we do here. And my model is not centered again, which I've just come to expect anymore. It's much more comfortable in the chair than next to it. But anyway, it's 9:09, so guess I should crack open the book. Again, I apologize ahead of time for all the coughing that I may do, because, well, if you're having to hear me do it, it's probably annoying you too. Again, I do have hot tea and water and such, so I will stay hydrated. Hot orange tea. I didn't put any honey in it, but honey's in my cough syrup, so I'm not worried. But anyway, for this first story of this Friday night of fairy tales, and also the title of one of the chapters in my biography, which I really need to get back to working on. I don't know, is the fan noise too loud? It doesn't look like it's registering too much on my microphone. But it's also not blowing at the microphone, so it should be okay. It looks like it's keeping it around 40 down in the green section, so I guess it's not that loud. I mean, it's louder than my library noises, so I guess I could turn the library noises up. The library noises are just a fireplace. Okay. Still don't know, did the sound alerts play? I heard it. I don't know if you guys heard it. Now see, it's not showing the alert going off on the screen, but it's showing it playing on audio. So I honestly don't know if it's playing or not. So I will go through and refresh all of those just to make sure. and then I'll get into the story. At least try to. So anyway, like I was saying, for this Friday Night of Fairy Tale is the first story of the evening. The Grateful Beasts. There was once upon a time a man and woman who had 3 fine-looking sons, but they were so poor that they could hardly have enough food for themselves, let alone their children. So the sons determined to set out into the world to try their luck. Before starting, their mother gave them each a loaf of bread and her blessing, and having taken a tender farewell of her and their father, the 3 set forth on their travels. The youngest of the 3 brothers, whose name was Furco, was a beautiful youth with a splendid figure, blue eyes, fair hair, and a complexion like milk and roses. His 2 brothers were as jealous of him as they could be, for they thought that his good looks he would be sure to be fortunate, or at least more fortunate than they could ever be. One day, all 3 were sitting resting under a tree, for the sun was hot and they were tired of walking. Furco fell fast asleep, but the other 2 remained awake, and the eldest said to the second brother, "What do you say about doing to our brother some harm? He is beautiful, and everyone takes a fancy to him, which is more than they do to us. If we could only get him out of the way, we might succeed better." "I quite agree with you," answered the second brother, "and my advice is to eat up his loaf of bread, and then to refuse to give him a bit of ours until he has promised to let us put out his eyes or break his legs." The eldest brother was delighted with this proposal, and the 2 wicked wretches seized Furco's bread and ate it all up, while the poor boy was still sound asleep. When he did awake, he felt very hungry and turned to eat his bread, but his brothers cried out, "You ate your loaf in your sleep, you glutton, and you may starve as long as you like, but we won't give you a scrap of ours." Furco was at a loss to understand how he could have eaten in his sleep, but he said nothing and fasted all day and the next night. But on the following morning he was so hungry that he burst into tears and implored his brothers to give him just a little bit of their bread. Then the cruel creatures laughed and repeated what they had said the day before. But when Furco continued to beg and beseech them, the eldest said at last, "If you will let us put out one of your eyes and break one of your legs, then we will give you a bit of our bread." At these words, poor Furco wept more bitterly than before, and bore the torments of hunger till the sun was high in the heavens. Then he could stand it no longer, and he consented to allow his left eye to be put out, and his left leg to be broken. I guess he's alright. When this was done, he stretched out his hand eagerly for a piece of bread, but his brothers gave him such a tiny scrap that the starving youth finished it in a moment, and besought them for a second bit. But the more Furco wept and told his brothers that he was dying of hunger, the more they laughed and scolded him for his greed. So he endured the pangs of starvation all that day. But when night came, his endurance gave way, and he let his right eye be put out, and his left leg be broken for a second piece of bread. After his brothers had thus successfully maimed and disfigured him for life, they left him groaning on the ground and continued their journey without him. Poor Furco ate up the scrap of bread they had left him and wept bitterly, but no one heard him or came to his help. Night came on, and the poor blind youth had no eyes to close. and could only crawl on the ground, not knowing in the least where he was going. But when the sun was once more high in the heavens, Ferko felt the blazing heat scorch him, and sought for some cool, shady place to rest his aching limbs. He climbed to the top of a hill and lay down in the grass, and as he thought, under the shadow of a big tree. But it was no tree he leaned against, but the gallows on which two ravens were seated. The one was saying to the other as the weary youth lay down,
"Is there anything at least wonderful or remarkable about this neighborhood?" "I think there just was," replied the other. "Many things that don't exist anywhere else in this world. There's a lake down there below us, and anyone who bathes in it, though he were at death's door, becomes sound and well on the spot. And those who wash their eyes with dew on the hill become as sharp-sighted as an eagle, even if they were blind from their youth."
"Well," answered the first raven,
"My eyes are not want for this healing bath, for heaven be praised, they are as good as they ever were. But my wing has been feeble and weak ever since it was shot by an arrow many years ago. So let us fly down to the lake at once, that I might be restored to health and strength again."
and so they flew away. Their words rejoiced Ferko's heart, and he waited impatiently until evening should come, and he could rub the precious dew on his sightless eyes. At last it began to grow dusk, and the sun sank behind the mountains. Gradually it became cooler on the hill, and the wet grass grew with dew. Then Ferko buried his face in the ground till his eyes were damp with dewdrops, and in a moment he saw clearer than he had ever done in his life before. The moon was shining brightly and lighted him to the lake where he could bathe his poor broken legs. Then Ferko crawled to the edge of the lake and dipped his limbs in the water. No sooner had he done so than he felt his legs as sound and strong as they had been before, and Ferko thanked the kind fate that had led him to the hill where he had overheard the ravens' conversations. He filled a bottle with the healing water and continued his journey in the best of spirits. He had not gone far before he met a wolf, who was limping disconsolately along on three legs, and who, on perceiving Ferko, began to howl dismally. "My good friend," said the youth, "be of good cheer, for I can soon heal your leg." And with these words he poured some of the precious water over the wolf's paw, and in a moment the animal was springing about, sound and well, on all four. The grateful creature thanked his benefactor warmly, and promised Ferko to do him a good turn, if he should ever need it. Ferko continued on his way till he came to a plowed field. Here he noticed a little mouse creeping warily along on its hind paw, for its front paw had been broken in a trap. Ferko felt so sorry for the little beast that he spoke to it in the most friendly manner and washed its small paw with the healing water. In a moment the mouse was sound and whole, and after thanking the kind physician, it scampered away over the plowed fields. Ferko again proceeded on his journey, but he hadn't gone far before a queen bee flew against him, trailing one wing behind her, which had been cruelly torn in two by a big bird. Ferko was no less willing to help her than he had been to help the wolf and the mouse, so he poured some healing drops over the wounded wing. On the spot, the queen bee was cured, and turning to Ferko, said, "I'm grateful for your kindness, and shall reward you someday." And with these words, she flew away, humming gaily.
Then Furco wandered on for many a long day, and at length reached a strange kingdom. Here, he thought to himself, he might as well go straight to the palace and offer his services to the king of the country, for he had heard that the king's daughter was as beautiful as the day. So he went to the royal palace, and as he entered the door, the first people he saw were his two brothers who had treated him so badly. They had managed to obtain places in the king's service, and when they recognized Furco with his eyes and legs sound and well, they were frightened to death, for they feared he would tell the king of their conduct, and that they would be hung. No sooner had Furco entered the palace than all eyes were turned on the handsome youth, and the king's daughter herself was lost in admiration, for she had never seen anyone so handsome in her life before. His brothers noticed this, and envy and jealousy were added to their fear, so much so that they determined once more to destroy him. They went to the king and told him that Furco was a wicked magician who had come to the palace with his intention of carrying off the princess. Then the king had Furco brought before him and said, "You are accused of being a magician who wishes to rob me of my daughter, and I condemn you to death. If you can fulfill 3 tasks, I shall set you to do your life will be spared, on condition you leave the country. But if you cannot perform what I demand, you shall be hung on the nearest tree." And, turning to the 2 wicked brothers, he said, "Suggest something for him to do, no matter how difficult. He must succeed in it, or die." They did not think long, but replied, "Let him build your majesty in one day a more beautiful palace than this, and if he fails in the attempt, let him be hung." The king was pleased with this proposal and commanded Furco to set forth at work the following day. The 2 brothers were delighted, for they thought they had got rid of Furco forever. The poor youth himself was heartbroken and cursed the hour he had crossed the boundary into the king's domain. As he was wandering disconsolately about the meadows around the palace, wondering how he could escape being put to death, a little bee flew past, and settling on his shoulder, whispered in his ear, "What is troubling you, my kind benefactor? Can I be of any service to you? I am the bee whose wing you healed, and would like to show my gratitude in some way." Furco recognized the queen bee and said, "Alas, how can you help me? For I have been set to do a task which no one in the whole world could do, let him be ever such a genius. Tomorrow I must build a palace more beautiful than the king's, and it must be finished before evening." "Is that all?" answered the bee. "Then you may comfort yourself, for before the sun is down tomorrow night, a palace shall be built unlike any the king has dwelt in before. Just stay here till I come again and tell you that it is finished." Having said this, she flew merrily away, and Furco, reassured by her words, lay down on the grass and slept peacefully until the next morning. On the following day, the whole town was on its feet, and everyone wondered how and where the stranger would build the wonderful palace. The princess alone was silent and sorrowful, and had cried all night till her pillow was wet, so much did she take the fate of the beautiful youth to heart. Furco spent the whole day in the meadow, waiting until the return of the bee. And when evening came, the queen flew by and perched on his shoulder, and she said, "The wonderful palace is ready. Be of good cheer and lead the king to the hillside just outside the city walls. And, humming gaily, she flew away again. Ferko at once went to the king and told him the palace was finished. The whole court went to see the wonder, and their astonishment was great at the sight which met their eyes. A splendid palace reared itself on the hill just outside the walls of the city, made of the most exquisite flowers that ever grew in a mortal garden. The roof was all of crimson roses, the windows of lilies, the walls of white carnations, the floors of growing auriculas and violets, the doors of gorgeous tulips and narcissi, with sunflowers for the knockers. And all around were hyacinthus and other sweet-smelling flowers bloomed in masses, so that the air was perfumed far and near, and enchanted all who were present. The splendid palace had been built by the grateful Queen Bee, who had summoned all the other bees in the kingdom to help her. The king's amazement knew no bounds, and the princess's eyes beamed with delight as she turned them from the wonderful building on the delighted Ferko. But the two brothers had grown quite green with envy, and only declared the more that Ferko was nothing but a wicked magician. The king, although he had been surprised and astonished at the way his commands had been carried out, was very vexed that the stranger should escape with his life, and turning to the two brothers he said, "He has certainly accomplished this first task, and the aid, no doubt, of his diabolical magic. But what shall we give him to do now? Let us make it as difficult as possible, and see if he fails. Then he should die." Then the eldest brother replied, "The corn has all been cut, but has not been put into the barns. Let the knave collect the grain from the kingdom into the one big heap before tomorrow night. And if as much of a stalk of corn is left, let him be put to death." The princess grew white with terror when she heard these words, but Ferko felt much more cheerful than he had done the first time, and wandered out into the meadow again, wondering how he was to get out of this difficulty. But he could think of no way of escape, and the sun sank to rest and night came on, when a little mouse started out of the grass at Ferko's feet, and said to him, "I am delighted to see you, my kind benefactor, but why are you looking so sad? Can I be of any help to you, and thus repay your great kindness to me?" Then Ferko recognized the mouse whose front paw he had healed, and replied, "Alas, how can you help me in a matter that is beyond any human power? Before tomorrow night, all the grain in the kingdom has to be gathered into one big heap, and if as much as a stalk of corn is wanting, I must pay for it with my life." "Oh, is that all?" answered the mouse. "That needn't distress you so much. Just trust in me, and before the sun sets again, you shall hear that your task is done." And with these words, the little creature scampered away into the fields. Ferko, who never doubted that the mouse would be as good as its word, lay down comforted on the soft grass and slept soundly till the next morning. The day passed slowly, and with the evening came the little mouse and said, "Now there's not a single stalk of corn left in the field. They're all collected in one big heap on the huts on the hill outside." Then Ferko went joyfully to the king and told him that all he demanded had been done. And the whole court went out to see the wonder, and were no less astonished than they had been the first time. For in a heap higher than the king's palace lay all the grain in the country, and not a single stalk of corn had been left behind in any of the fields. And how had all this been done? Well, the little mouse had summoned every other mouse in the kingdom to help, and together they had collected all of the grain. The king, he could not hide his amazement, But at the same time his wrath increased, and he was more ready than ever to believe the two brothers who kept on repeating that Ferko was nothing more or less than a wicked magician. Only the beautiful princess rejoiced over Ferko's success, and looked on him with friendly glances when the youth returned. The more the cruel king gazed on the wonder before him, the more angry he became, for he could not, in the face of his promise, put a stranger to death. He turned once more to the two brothers and said, "His diabolical magical has helped him again, but now a third task shall we set him to do. No matter how impossible it is, he must do it or die." The eldest answered quickly, "Let him drive all the wolves of the kingdom onto this hill before tomorrow night. If he does this, he may go free. If not, he shall be hung, as you said." At these words, the princess burst into tears, and when the king saw this, he ordered her to be shut up in a high tower and carefully guarded till the dangerous magician should either have left the kingdom or been hung on the nearest tree. Ferko wandered out into the fields again and sat down on the stump of a tree, wondering what he should do next. Suddenly, a big wolf ran up to him and, standing still, said, "I'm very glad to see you again, my kind benefactor. What are you thinking about all alone by yourself? If I can help you in any way, only say the word, for I would like to give you proof of my gratitude." Ferko at once recognized the wolf whose broken leg he had healed, and told him what he had to do the following day if he wished to escape with his life. "But how in the world," he added, "am I to collect all the wolves of the kingdom on top of that hill over there?" "Well, if that's all you want done," answered the wolf, "you needn't worry yourself. I'll undertake the task, and you'll hear from me again before sunset tomorrow. Keep your spirits up." And with these words, he trotted quickly away. Then the youth rejoiced greatly, for now he felt that his life was safe, but he grew very sad when he thought of the beautiful princess, and that he would never see her again if he left the country. He lay down once more on the grass, and soon fell fast asleep. Oh, the next day he spent wandering about the fields. Towards evening, the wolf came running up to him in a great hurry and said, "I have collected together all the wolves in the kingdom, and they are waiting for you out in the wood. Go quickly to the king and tell him you will go to the hill, that he may see the wonder that you have done with his own eyes. Then return at once to me and get on my back, and I will help you drive all the wolves together." Then Ferko went straight to the palace and told the king that he was ready to perform the third task if he would come to the hill and see it done. Ferko himself returned to the fields, and mounting on the wolf's back, he rode to the wood close by. As quick as lightning, the wolf flew around the wood, and in a minute many hundred wolves rose up before him, increasing in number every moment, till they could be counted by thousands. He drove them all before him on the hill where the king and his whole court and Ferko's two older brothers were standing. Only the lovely princess was not present, for she was shut up in the tower weeping bitterly. The wicked brothers stamped and foamed with rage when they saw the failure of their wicked designs. But the king was overcome by sudden terror when he saw the enormous pack of wolves approaching nearer and nearer. And calling out to Ferko, he said, "Enough, enough! We don't want to see any more." But on the wolf whose back Ferko sat said to its rider, "Go on, go on." And at the same moment, many more wolves ran up the hill, howling horribly and showing their white teeth.
The king, in his terror, called out, "Stop a moment! I will give you half my kingdom if you will drive all the wolves away." But Ferko pretended not to hear, and drove some more thousands before him, so that everyone quaked with horror and fear. Then the king raised his voice again and called out, "Stop! You shall have my whole kingdom, if you will only drive these wolves back to the places they came from." But the wolf kept encouraging Ferko and said, "Go on, go on." So he led the wolves on, till at last they fell on the king and his wicked brothers, and ate them and the whole court up in a moment. Then Ferko went straight to the palace and set the princess free, and on the same day he married her and was crowned king of the country, and the wolves all went peacefully back to their own homes, and Ferko and his bride lived for many years in peace and happiness together, and were much beloved by great and small in the land. At least the wolves got a royal buffet. See? Happy ending for the wolves. Always a fun story. Dang, forgot to mute that time. Okay. Oh, I missed the X-ray. Oh well. Our next wonderful fairy tale for this Friday night: The Giants and the Herd Boy. There was once upon a time a poor boy who had neither father nor mother. In order to gain a living, he looked after the sheep of a great lord. Day and night he spent out in the open fields, and only when it was very wet and stormy did he take refuge in a little hut on the edge of a big forest. Now, one night, when he was sitting on the grass beside his flocks, he heard, not very far from him, the sound of if something were crying. He rose and followed the direction of the noise. To his dismay and astonishment, he found a giant lying at the entrance of the wood. He was just about to run us off as fast as his legs could carry him, when the giant called out, "Don't be afraid, I won't harm you. On the contrary, I will reward you handsomely if you will bind up my foot. I hurt it when I was trying to root up an oak tree." The herd boy took off his shirt and bound the giant's wounded foot with it. Then the giant rose up and said, "Now come, and I will reward you. We are going to celebrate a marriage today, and I promise you shall have plenty of fun. Come and enjoy yourself, but in order that my brothers mayn't see you, put on this band around your waist, and then you'll be invisible." With these words he handed the herd boy a belt, and walking on in front, led him to a fountain where hundreds of giants and giantesses were assembled, preparing to hold a wedding. They danced and played different games till midnight. Then one of the giants tore up a plant by its roots, and all the giants and giantesses made themselves so thin that they disappeared into the earth through the hole made in the uprooting of the plant. The wounded giant remained behind to the last and called out, "Herd boy, where are you?" "Here I am, close to you," was the reply. "Touch me," said the giant, "so that you too may come with us underground." The herd boy did as he was told, and before he could have believed it possible,
he found himself in a big hall where even the walls were made of pure gold. Then, to his astonishment, he saw that the hall was furnished with the tables and chairs that belonged to his master. In a few minutes, the company began to eat and drink. The banquet was a gorgeous one, and the poor youth fell to and ate all and drank lustily. When he had eaten and drunk as much as he could, he thought to himself, "Why shouldn't I put a loaf of bread in my pocket? I shall be glad of it tomorrow." So he seized the loaf when no one was looking and stowed it away under his tunic. No sooner had he done so than the wounded giant limped up to him and whispered softly, "Oh boy, where are you?" "Here I am," replied the youth. "Then hold on to me," said the giant, "so that I may lead you up above again." So the herd boy held on to the giant, and in a few moments he found himself on the earth once more. But the giant had vanished. The herd boy returned to his sheep and took off the invisible belt, which he had carefully put in his bag. The next morning the lad felt hungry, and he thought he would cut off a piece of the loaf he had carried away from the giant's wedding feast and eat it. But although he tried with all his might, he couldn't cut off the smallest piece. Then, in despair, he bit the loaf, and what was his astonishment when a piece of gold fell out of his mouth and rolled at his feet. He bit the bread a second and third time, and each time a piece of gold fell out of his mouth, but the bread remained untouched. The herd boy was so very much delighted over this stroke of good fortune, and hiding the magic loaf in his bag, he hurried off to the nearest village to buy himself something to eat, and then returned to his sheep. Now the lord whose sheep the herd boy looked after had a very lovely daughter, who always smiled and nodded to the youth when she walked with her father in the fields. For a long time the herd boy had made up his mind to prepare a surprise for this beautiful creature for her birthday. So, when the day approached, he put on his invisible belt, took a sack of gold pieces with him, and slipping into her room in the middle of the night, he placed the bag of gold beside her bed, and then he returned to his sheep. The girl's joy was great, and so were his parents the next day when they found the sack full of gold pieces. The herd boy was so pleased to think what pleasure he had given. The next night he placed another bag of gold beside the girl's bed. And this he continued to do for 7 nights, and the girl and her parents made up their mind that it must be a good fairy who brought the gold every night. But one night they determined to watch and to see from their hiding place who the bringer of the sack of gold really was. On the 8th night, a fearful storm of wind and rain came through. The herd boy was on his way to bring the beautiful girl another bag of gold. Then for the first time he noticed, just as he reached his master's house, that he had forgotten the belt which made him invisible. He didn't like the idea of going back to his hut in the wind and wet, so he just stepped as he was into the girl's room, laid the sack of gold beside her, and was turning to leave the room when his master confronted him and said, "You, young rogue! So you were going to steal the gold that the good fairy brings every night, weren't you?" The herd boy was so taken aback by his words that he stood trembling before him, and did not dare to explain his presence. Then his master spoke. "As you have hitherto always behaved well in my service, I will not send you to prison, but leave your place instantly and never let me see your face again." So the herd boy went back to his hut, and taking his loaf and belt with him, he went to the nearest town. There he bought clothes for himself, very fine clothes, and a beautiful coach with 4 horses, hired 2 servants, and then drove back to his master. You may imagine how astonished he was to see his herd boy returning to him with manner. Then the youth told him about the piece of good luck that had befallen him, and asked him for the hand of his beautiful daughter. This was readily granted, and the two lived in peace and happiness to the end of their lives. Short and sweet. Giants live underground. For you. Anyway, for our next wonderful fairy tale for this Friday night, The Invisible Prince. Once upon a time, there lived a fairy who had powers over the earth, the sea, fire, and air. This fairy had 4 sons. The eldest, who was quick and lively, with a vivid imagination, she made the Lord of Fire, which was, in her opinion, the noblest of all the elements. To the second son, whose wisdom and prudence made amends for his being rather dull, she gave the government of the earth. The third was wild and savage and had of a monstrous stature, and the fairy, his mother, who was ashamed of his defects, hoped to hide him by creating him as the king of seas. The youngest, who was a slave of his passions and had a very uncertain temper, became the prince of the air. Being the youngest, he was naturally his mother's favorite, but this did not blind her to his weaknesses, and she foresaw that someday he would suffer much pain through falling in love. So she thought the best thing she could do was to bring him up with a horror of women, and to her great delight, she saw this dislike only increase as he grew older. From his earliest childhood, he heard nothing but stories of princes who had fallen into all sorts of troubles through love, and she drew such terrible pictures of poor little Cupid that the young man had no difficulty in believing that he was the root of all evil. All of that time that this wise mother could spare from filling her son with hatred for all womankind, she passed in giving him a love of the pleasures of the chase, which henceforth became his chief joy. For his amusement she had made a new forest and planted the most splendid trees, and turned loose in it every animal that can be found in any of the 4 quarters of the globe. In the midst of the forest she placed a palace which had not its equal in beauty in the whole world, and then she considered that she had done enough to make any prince happy. Now, it is very well and good to abuse the god of love, but a man cannot struggle against his fate. In his secret heart, the prince got tired of his mother's constant talk on the subject, and one day, when she quitted the palace to attend some business, begging him never to go beyond his grounds, he at once jumped at the chance of disobeying her. Left to himself, the prince soon forgot the wise counsel of his mother, and feeling very much bored with his own company, he ordered some of the spirits of the air to carry him to the court of a neighboring sovereign. The kingdom was situated on the island of Roses, where the climate is so delicious that the grass is always green and the flowers always sweet. The waves, instead of beating on the rocks, seem to die gently on the shore, and clusters of golden bushes cover the land, and the vines were bent low with grapes. The king of the island had a daughter named Rosalie, who was more lovely than any girl in the whole world. No sooner had the eyes of the Prince of the Air rested on her than he forgot all the terrible woes which had been prophesied to him ever since he was born. For in a single moment the plans of years were often upset. He instantly began to think how best to make himself happy, and the shortest way that occurred to him was to have Rosalie carried off by his attendant spirits. It was easy to imagine the feelings of the king when he found out that his daughter had vanished. Duh. He wept her loss night and day, and his only comfort was to talk it over with a young and unknown prince who had just arrived in the court. Alas, he did not know what deep interest the stranger had in Rosalie, for he, too, had seen her and had fallen victim to her charms. One day the king, more sorrowful than usual, was walking sadly along the seashore when, after a long silence, the unknown prince, who was his only companion, suddenly spoke. "There is no evil without a remedy," he said to the unhappy father. "If you will promise me your daughter in marriage, I will undertake to bring her back to you." "You are trying to soothe me with vain promises," answered the king. "Did I not see her caught up in the air, in spite of cries which would have softened the heart of anyone but the barbarian who has robbed her of me? The unfortunate girl is pining away in some unknown land, where perhaps no foot of man has ever trod, and I shall see her no more. But go, generous stranger, bring back Rosalie if you can, and live happy with her ever after in this country, of which I now declare you the heir." Although the stranger's name and rank were unknown to Rosalie's father, he was really the son of the king of the Golden Isle, which had for a capital city that extended from one sea to another. The walls, washed by quiet waters, were covered with gold, which made one think of the yellow sands. Above them, a rampart of orange and lemon trees, and all the streets were paved with gold. The king of this beautiful island had one son, for whom a life of adventure had been foretold at his birth. This so frightened his father and mother that, in order to comfort them, a fairy, who happened to be present at the time, produced a little pebble which he told them to keep for the prince till he grew up, as by putting it in his mouth he would become invisible. As long as he didn't try to speak, for the stone would lose all its virtue. In this way, the good fairy hoped the prince would be protected against all dangers. No sooner did the prince begin to grow out of boyhood than he longed to live to see other countries of the world, to see if they were as splendid as the one which he lived. So, under pretense of visiting some small islands that belonged to his father, he set out. But a frightful storm drove his ship on an unknown shores, where most of his followers were put to death by the savages, and the prince himself only managed to escape by making use of his magic pebble. By this means he passed through the mist of the unseen, and wandered on till he reached the coast, where he re-embarked on board his ship. The first land he sighted was the Island of Roses, and he went at once to the court of the king, Rosalie's father. The moment his eyes beheld the princess, he fell in love with her like everyone else. He had already spent several months in this condition when the prince of the air whirled her away, to the grief and despair of every man on the island. But, sad though everyone was, the prince of the Golden Isle was perfectly inconsolable, and passed both days and nights in bemoaning his loss. "Alas," he cried, "shall I never see the lovely princess again? Who knows where she may be, and what fairy may have her in his keeping? I am only a man, but I am strong in my love, and I shall seek the whole world through till I find her." So saying, he left the court, and made ready for his journey. He traveled many weary days without hearing a single word of the lost princess, until one morning, as he was walking through a thick forest, he suddenly perceived a magnificent palace standing at the end of a pine avenue, and his heart bounded to think that he might be gazing on Rosalie's prison. He hastened his steps and quickly arrived at the gates of the palace, which was formed of a single gate. The gate swung open to let him through, and he next passed successively 3 courts, surrounded by deep ditches filled with running water, with birds of brilliant plumage flying about the banks. Everything around was rare and beautiful. but the prince scarcely raised his eyes to all these wonders. He thought only of the princess and where he should find her. But in vain he opened every door and searched in every corner. He neither saw Rosalie nor anyone else. At last there was no place left for him to search but a little wood, which contained in the center a sort of hall built entirely of orange trees, with 4 small rooms opening out of the corners. 3 of these were empty, except for statues and wonderful things. But in the 4th, the invisible prince caught sight of Rosalie. His joy at beholding her again was, however, some lessened by seeing that the Prince of Air was kneeling at her feet and pleading his own cause. But it was in vain that he implored her to listen. She only shook her head. "No," was all she would say. "You snatched me from my father whom I loved, and all the splendor in the world can never console me. Go, I can never feel anything toward you but hate and contempt." With these words she turned away and entered her own apartments. Unknown to herself, the invisible prince had followed her, but fearing to be discovered by the princess in the presence of others, he made up his mind to wait quietly until dark. And he employed the long hours in writing a poem to the princess, which he laid on the bed beside her. This done, he thought of nothing but how best to deliver Rosalie, and he resolved to take advantage of a visit which the Prince of Air paid every year to his mother and brothers, in order to strike the blow. One day, Rosalie was sitting alone in her room thinking of her troubles when she suddenly saw a pen get up off the desk and begin to write all by itself on a sheet of white paper. As she did not know that it was guided by an invisible hand, she was very much astonished. At the moment that the pen had ceased to move, she instantly went over to the table, where she found some lovely verses, telling her that another shared her distress, whatever they may be, and loved her with all his heart, and that he would never rest until he had delivered her from the hands of the man she hated. These encouraged her, and she told him all her story, and of the arrival of a young stranger in her father's palace. His looks had so charmed her that since that day she had thought of no one else. At these words the prince could contain himself no longer. He took the pebble from his mouth and flung himself at Rosalie's feet. When they had got over the first rapture of meeting, they began to make plans to escape from the power of the Prince of the Air. But this did not prove easy, for the magic stone would only serve one person at a time. Or, in order to save Rosalie, the Prince of the Golden Isle would have to expose himself to the fury of his enemy. But Rosalie would not hear of this. "No, Prince," she said. "Since you are here on this island, it no longer feels a prison. Besides, you are under the protection of a fairy, who always visits your father's court at this season. Go instantly and seek her, and when she is found, implore her the gift of another stone with similar powers. Once you have that, there will be no further difficulty in the way of escape." The Prince of the Air returned a few days later from his mother's palace, but the invisible prince had already set out. He had, however, entirely forgotten the road by which he had come, and lost himself for so long in the forest that when he at last reached home, the fairy had already left, and in spite of all his grief, there was nothing to do for it but wait till the fairy's next visit, and allow Rosalie to suffer 3 months longer. This thought drove him to despair, and he had almost made up his mind to return to the palace of her captivity, when one day, as he was strolling along an alley in the woods, he saw a huge oak open its trunk, and out of it stepped 2 princes in earnest conversation. As our hero had the magic stone in his mouth, they imagined themselves alone, and did not bother to lower their voices. "What?" said one. "Are you always going to allow yourself to be tormented by a passion which can never end happily? And in your whole kingdom can you find nothing else to satisfy yourself?" "What is the use," replied the other, "of being the prince of the gnomes and having a mother who is queen of all 4 elements, if I cannot have the love of Princess Ogdenton? From the moment I first saw her sitting in the forest, surrounded by flowers, I've never ceased to think of her night and day, and although I love her, I'm convinced that she will never care for me. You know that I have in my palace a cabinet of years, and the first great mirror reflects the past, and the second, we contemplate the present, and the third, the future can be read. It was here that I fled after I gazed on Princess Argentine, but instead of love, I only saw scorn and contempt. Think how great must be my devotion when, in spite of my faith, I still love on. Now the Prince of the Golden Isle was enchanted with this conversation, for the Princess Argentine was his sister. And he hoped, by means of her influence on the Prince of Gnomes, to obtain from his brother the release of Rosalie. So he joyously returned to his father's palace, where he found his friend the fairy, who at once presented him with a magic pebble like his own. As may be imagined, he lost no time in setting out to deliver Rosalie, and traveled so fast that he soon arrived at the forest, in the midst of which she lay captive. But though he found the palace, he did not find Rosalie. He hunted high and low, and there was no sign of her, and his despair was so great that he was ready, 1,000 times over, to take his own life. At last he remembered the conversation of the two princes about the cabinet of the years, and of that he could manage to reach the oak tree. He would be certain to discover what had become of Rosalie. Happily, he soon found out the secret passage and entered the cabinet of the present, where he saw reflected in the mirrors unfortunate Rosalie sitting on the floor, weeping bitterly, and surrounded with genii who never left her day or night. This sight only increased the misery of the prince, for he did not know where this castle was, nor how to set about finding it. However, he resolved to seek the whole world till he came to the right place. He began by setting sail with a favorable wind, but his bad luck followed him even on the sea. He scarcely had caught sight of land when the violent storm arose, and after several hours of beating about, the vessel was driven on some rocks, on which it dashed itself to bits. The prince was fortunate enough to be able to lay hold of a floating spar, and contrived to keep himself afloat, and after a long struggle with the winds and waves, he was cast upon a strange island. But what was his surprise on reaching the shore to hear the sounds of his most heart-rending distress, mingled with the sweetest songs which had ever charmed him. His curiosity was instantly roused, and he advanced cautiously till he saw 2 huge dragons guarding the gate of the wood. And they were terrible indeed to look upon. Their bodies were covered with glittering scales, the curly tails extended far over the land. Flames darted from their mouths and noses, and their eyes would have been able to make the bravest shudder. But the prince was invisible, and they did not see him. He slipped past them into the wood. He found himself at once in a labyrinth, and wandered about for a long time without meeting anyone. In fact, he only saw a circle of human hands sticking out of the ground above the wrist, each with a bracelet of gold on which a name was written. The farther he advanced in the labyrinth, the more curious he became, till he was stopped by 2 corpses lying in the midst of a cypress alley, each with a scarlet cord around his neck and a bracelet on his arm, on which were engraved their own names, and those of 2 princesses. The invisible prince recognized these dead men as kings of 2 large islands near his own home, but the names of the princesses were unknown to him. He grieved for their unhappy fate, and at once proceeded to bury them. But no sooner had he laid them in their graves than their hands started up from the earth, and remained sticking up like those of their fellows. The prince went on his way, thinking about this strange adventure, when suddenly at the turn of the walk he perceived a tall man whose face was a picture of misery, holding in his hands a silken cord of the exact color of those around the necks of the dead men. A few steps further, this man came up with another miserable to the full as he himself. They silently embraced, and then, without a word, passed the cords around their throats and fell dead, side by side. In vain the prince rushed to their assistance and strove to undo the cord. He could not loosen it, so he buried them like the others and continued on his path. He felt, however, that great prudence was necessary, or he himself might become the victim of some enchantment, and he was thankful to slip past the dragons and to enter the beautiful park, with clear streams and sweet flowers, and a crowd of men and maidens. He could not forget the terrible things he had seen, and hoped eagerly for a clue to the mystery, noticing two young people talking together. He drew near, thinking that he might get some explanation of what puzzled him, and so he did. "You swear," said the prince, "that you will love me till you die, but I fear your faithless heart, and I feel that I shall soon have to seek the fairy Despair, ruler of this half of the island. She carries off lovers who have been cast away by their mistresses, and wish to have done with life. She places them in a labyrinth where they are condemned to walk forever, with a bracelet on their arm and a cord around their necks, unless they meet another as miserable as themselves. Then the cord is pulled, and they lie where they fall, till they are buried by the first passer-by." "Terrible as this fate would be," added the prince, "it would be sweeter than the life if I had lost your love." The sight of all these happy lovers made the prince grieve the more, and he wandered along the seashore, spending his days. But one day he was sitting on a rock, bewailing his fate, and the impossibility of leaving the island, when all in a moment the sea appeared to raise itself near by the skies, and caves echoed with the hideous screams. As he looked, a woman rose from the depths of the sea, madly flying before a furious giant. The cries she uttered softened the heart of the prince, so he took the stone from his mouth, and drawing his sword, he rushed at the giant, as to give the lady some time to escape. But hardly had he come within reach of the enemy than the giant touched him with a ring that he held in his hand, and the prince remained immobile where he stood. The giant then hastily rejoined his prey, and seizing her by arms, he plunged her into the sea. And then he sent some tritons to bind chains around the Prince of the Golden Isle, and he too felt himself borne to the depths of the ocean, and without the hope of ever seeing the princess. Now the giant whom the invisible prince had so rashly attacked was the Lord of the Sea, and the third son of the Queen of the Elements, and he had touched the youth with a magic ring which enabled a mortal to live underwater. So the Prince of the Golden Isle found, when he bound his chains in the Tritons, when he was carried to the homes of strange monsters and past immense seaweed forests, till he reached a vast sandy space, surrounded by huge rocks. On the tallest of the rocks sat the giant on a stone. "Rash mortal," he said, when the prince was dragged before him, "you have deserved death, but you shall only live to suffer more cruelly. Go, and add to the number of those whom it is my pleasure to torture." At these words, the unhappy prince found himself tied to a rock, but he was not alone in his misfortune, for all around him were chained princes and princesses whom the giant had led captive. Indeed, it was a chief delight to create a storm in order to add to his list of prisoners. As his hands were fastened, it was impossible for the Prince of the Golden Isle to make use of his magic stone, and he passed his nights and days dreaming of Rosalie. But at the last time, when the giant took it into his head to amuse himself by arranging fights between some of his captives, lots were drawn, and one fell upon our prince, whose chains were immediately loosened. The moment he was set free, he snatched up a stone and became invisible. The astonishment of the giant at the sudden disappearance of the prince may well be imagined. He ordered all the passages to be watched, but it was too late. The prince had already glided between two rocks. He wandered for a while through the forests, where he met nothing but fearful monsters. He climbed rock after rock, steered his way from tree to tree, till at length he arrived at the edge of the sea. At the foot of a mountain that he remembered he had seen a cabinet of presents, where Rosalie was held captive. Filled with joy, he made his way to the top of the mountain which pierced the clouds, and there he found a palace. He entered, and in the middle of the long gallery he discovered a crystal room. In the midst of the room sat Rosalie, guarded night and day by Genie. There was no door anywhere, nor any window. At this, the excited prince became more puzzled than ever, for he did not know how he was to warn Rosalie of his return. Yet it broke his heart to see her weeping from dawn till dark. One day, as Rosalie was walking up and down her room, she was surprised to see the crystal that served for a wall had grown cloudy, as if someone had breathed on it. And what was more, wherever she moved, the brightness of the crystal always became clouded. It was enough to cause the princess to suspect that her lover had returned. In order to set the Prince of Air's mind at rest, she began by being gracious to him, so that she begged that her captivity might be a little lightened should she be not refused. But first, the only favor she asked was to be allowed to walk for 1 hour every day up and down the long gallery. This was granted, and the invisible prince speedily took the opportunity of handing her the stone, and which she slipped into her mouth. No words can paint the fury of her captor at her disappearance. He ordered the spirits of the air to fly through all space and to bring back Rosalie wherever she might be. They instantly flew off to obey his commands and spread themselves over the whole earth. Meanwhile, Rosalie and the invisible prince had reached, hand in hand, the door of the gallery which led through the entrance of the gardens. In silence, they glided along and thought themselves already safe, when a furious monster dashed itself against, on accident, Rosalie and the invisible prince, and in her fright she let go of her hand. No one can speak as long as he is invisible, and besides, they knew that the spirits were all around them, and at the slightest sound they would be recognized. So all they could do was to feel about and hope that their hands might once more meet. But, alas, the joy of liberty lasted but a short time. The princess, having wandered in vain up and down the forest, stopped at last on the edge of a fountain. And she wrote on the trees, "If ever the prince, my lover, comes this way, let him know that it was here I dwell. And I sit daily on the edge of this fountain, mingling my tears with its waters." These words were read by one of the genii, who repeated them to his master. The Prince of the Air, in his turn, making himself invisible, was led to the fountain and waited for Rosalie. When she drew near, he held out his hand, which she grasped eagerly, taking it for that of her lover. And seizing his opportunity, the prince passed a cord around her arm, and throwing off the invisibility, he cried to his spirits to drag her into the lowest pit. It was at this moment that the invisible prince appeared, and at the sight of the prince of the genii mounted into the air, holding a silken cord, he guessed instantly that they were carrying off Rosalie. He felt so overwhelmed by despair that he thought for an instant of putting an end to his life. "Can I survive my misfortunes?" he cried. "I fancied I had come to an end of my troubles, and now they are worse than ever. What will become of me? Never can I discover the place where this monster has hidden my Rosalie." The unhappy youth had determined to let himself die, and indeed his sorrows alone was enough to kill him. Where he thought that by means of the cabinets of the years he might find out where the princess was imprisoned, and that gave him a little ray of hope. So he continued to walk on through the forest, and after some hours he arrived at the gate of the temple, guarded by 2 huge lions. Being invisible, he was able to enter unharmed. In the middle of the temple was an altar, on which lay a book, and behind the altar hung a great curtain.
The prince approached the altar and opened the book, which contained the names of all the lovers in the world. And in it he read that Rosalie had been carried off by the Prince of the Air to an abyss which had no entrance except the one that lay by way of the Fountain of Gold. Now, as the prince was not the smallest idea of where this fountain was to be found, it might be thought that he was not much nearer to Rosalie than before. This was not, however, view taken by the prince. Every step that I take perhaps leads me further from her, he thought to himself. I'm so thankful to know that she is alive somewhere. On leaving the temple of the invisible prince saw 6 paths lying before him, each of which led through the wood. He was hesitating to choose which one, and then suddenly he beheld 2 people coming toward him down the track which lay most to his right. They turned out to be the Prince Gnome and his friend, and the sudden desire to give some news of his sister, the Princess Argentine, caused the invisible prince to follow them and to listen to their conversation. Do you think, the Prince Gnome was saying, do you think that I would not break my chains if I could? I know that the Princess Argentine will never love me, yet each day I feel her dearer still. And, as if it were not enough, I have the horror of feeling that she probably loves another. So I resolve to put myself out of my pain by the means of the golden fountain. A single drop of its water falling on the sand will trace the name of my rival into her heart. I dread the test, and yet this very dread convinces me of my misfortune. It may be imagined that after listening to these words, the invisible prince followed the Prince Gnome like a shadow, and after walking some time, they arrived at the golden fountain. The unhappy lover stooped down with a sigh, and dipping his finger into the well, let it drop on the sand. It instantly wrote the name of Prince Flame, his brother. The shock of this discovery was so real that Prince Gnome sank fainting into the arms of his friend. Meanwhile, the invisible prince was turning over in his mind how he could best deliver Rosalie. And since he had been touched by the giant's ring, he had the power to live in the water as well as on the land. And once he dived into the fountain, he perceived in one corner a door leading into the mountain, and at the foot of the mountain was a high rock, on which was fixed an iron ring with a cord attached. The prince promptly guessed that the cord was used to chain the princess, and drew his sword and cut it. In a moment he felt the princess's hand on his, for she had always kept her magic pebble in his mouth. In spite of the prayers and entreaties of the Prince of Air to make her so visible. So hand in hand, the invisible prince and Rosalie crossed the mountain, but as the princess had no power of living underwater, she could not pass the golden fountain. Speechless and invisible, they clung together on the brink, trembling at the frightful tempest the Prince of Air had raised in his fury. The storm had already lasted many days when tremendous heat began to make itself felt. The lightning flashed, the thunder rattled, firebolts fell from the heaven, burning up the forests and even the fields of corn. In one instant, the very streams were dried up, and the prince, seizing his opportunity, carried the princess over the fountain of gold. It took them a long time still to reach the Golden Isle, but at last they got there, and may be quite sure they never wanted to leave it ever again. Okay, so my computer just decided that it went blue screen while I was streaming, of course. So I don't know if the stream froze or it says it's still streaming. So hopefully it did not die on me. Sorry. Okay. How long is this next story? The Invisible Prince was 18 pages long. Looks like I will be able to do at least one more story for tonight. Sorry for coughing. At least I've kept the coughing out of the stories for the most part, I think. Anyway. Okay. So, chat, if you can hear me, post a message, please. Or sound alert or something. Because it seems that my video processor has decided to freeze. I can't even open OBS. Oh, come on. That's not what I wanted. Okay, so I don't know what's happening. Am I still going? Or did my stream completely freeze? Oh, my model has frozen. Oh, damn. Well, I guess that answers that question. No, thank you everyone for coming by. I guess I won't read that last story. Since, you know, everything is a crash on me. So let's see if I can at least raid someone.
Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight. Exit light.
I don't.
Night. Take my hand.
See any of the reading crew on.
Never, never land. Something's wrong. Shut the light. Heavy thoughts
So
tonight, and they aren't Snow White. Dreams of war, dreams of liars, dreams of dragons, fire, and the things that will light.
I guess we will go ahead and raid out.
Sleep with one eye
Looks like
open.
Dusk hasn't been on for very long, so let's go ahead and raid her. And thank everyone for coming in.
Light.
I really can't see who was on or anything because
Take
my computer is stupid.
We're off to never,
So
never.
let's go ahead and raid Dusk and hope that everything else is fine.
Now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my
Again,
soul.
thank you all for coming in tonight.
If I die,
And I hope you have a good evening. And
pray the Lord my soul to
yeah,
die.
I will see you all hopefully later.
Baby, don't say a word. And never
Have a good night.
mind